Don't sign anything. Please, you have to trust me, the young nurse whispered in terror, and then she disappeared. My name is Olivia Chin, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of how my sister's trust became her death sentence. The doctors called it mercy. The hospital called it protocol. My husband called it necessary. But when I found the security footage, I realized someone had orchestrated the most terrible betrayal imaginable, and the one person who tried to stop it paid the ultimate price. The ICU hallways smelled like antiseptic and desperation. I remember standing outside my sister Sarah's room on that Tuesday morning in March, watching the monitors through the glass, seeing the green lines pulse with life, even though the doctors kept insisting there was no one home inside that body anymore. Sarah had always been the strong one, the nurse herself for 15 years before the massive stroke changed everything in a single moment. She'd always said she never wanted to be a burden, never wanted machines keeping her alive. That part was true. What wasn't true was everything that came after. The first thing you need to understand about my family is that we were close, probably closer than most people are these days. Our mother raised Sarah and me after our father left, working 3 jobs to keep us in a decent neighborhood, teaching us that integrity meant something, that family was sacred. Sarah became a nurse because she wanted to help people. I became a lawyer because I wanted to protect them. We talked almost every day, shared secrets, supported each other through breakups and job changes, and all the mundane moments that actually make up a life. When Sarah married James Patterson 8 years ago, I was happy for her, genuinely happy. He was charming, successful, a financial advisor who seemed to check every box. He made Sarah laugh. He brought her flowers. He told her he loved her constantly. But looking back now, I can see the subtle ways control creeps into a relationship, the way it disguises itself as care, as protection, as love. James didn't want Sarah working so many hours. James thought her friends were a bad influence. James felt more comfortable if he managed the finances, since he was so good with money. Nothing was ever said, harshly. It was all delivered with a smile and a kiss on the forehead. By the time Sarah had her stroke, James had carefully isolated her from almost everyone who loved her, and he was the one who made every decision. The stroke happened on a Sunday afternoon in February. Sarah was at home alone while James was at the office. She'd complained of a headache that morning, but she'd had migraines before and never made a big deal of it. James found her when he got home, unconscious on the kitchen floor, and he called an ambulance. The doctors said she'd had a massive cerebral hemorrhage, the kind that causes catastrophic brain damage. They stabilized her, put her on life support, and within 24 hours, they were using the language that hospitals use in these situations. No brain activity, minimal reflexes, devastating prognosis. They recommended ending life support. And James, who had been married to my sister for less than a decade, who had spent the last few years slowly erasing her from her own life, was the one who got to make that decision. I arrived at the hospital the day after the stroke, flying in from Los Angeles where I worked, leaving important cases and meetings behind without a second thought. The moment I walked into that ICU, everything felt wrong. Sarah's body was there in the bed, yes, but the way the machines surrounded her felt less like medical care and more like theater, like someone was performing the role of saving her while actually managing her death. James was in the waiting room when I arrived, looking appropriately devastated, dressed impeccably even in grief. He stood when I came in and pulled me into a hug that felt performative, and he said, "I'm so glad you're here, Liv. We need to make some difficult decisions, and I need your support to do the right thing." The doctors met with us that afternoon, and they presented their case with the clinical efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Severe brain damage. No meaningful recovery expected. Quality of life would be essentially non-existent. The most compassionate option would be to remove life support and let her pass peacefully. They showed us scans, charts, explained the mechanics of organ failure, used words like humane and dignified. But something in my legal mind, the part trained to look for inconsistencies, started flagging details that didn't quite fit. Sarah's pupils still responded to light. When I held her hand, I swore I felt pressure back. The monitor showed a consistent heart rhythm, not the chaotic deterioration they were describing. I asked questions. Specific questions. Can we try more aggressive therapy? What does rehabilitation look like? How often do patients with similar injuries show improvement? And each time I asked, the doctors exchanged glances, and their answers became shorter, less detailed, more insistent on the hopelessness of the situation. That night, James tried to convince me we should sign the Do Not Resuscitate order and the organ donation forms as quickly as possible. He kept saying he didn't want Sarah to suffer, that he couldn't bear to see her in pain, that prolonging this was cruelty. He had already discussed it with the doctors, he said. They all agreed it was the right choice. He'd already begun planning a funeral. He had a lawyer ready to help us with paperwork. Everything was prepared. And that's when something in me shifted, some instinct honed from years of practicing law, from listening to clients, from learning to identify when someone was rushing a decision for reasons that had nothing to do with compassion. I told James the first needed more time, that I wanted a second opinion, that I wasn't signing anything until I understood the full medical picture.
He didn't take that well.
His face darkened in a way I'd never seen before, and he said things like, "I'm her husband, Olivia. I know what she wanted, and you're being selfish, trying to prolong her suffering for your own emotional reasons, and the doctors have made their recommendation, and you're undermining me in front of medical professionals." But I held firm. I said I wanted to hire an independent neurologist to evaluate Sarah. I said I wanted to see all her medical records. I said I wanted time. James left the hospital angry that night, and I sat alone with my sister, watching her breathe, feeling more certain with every breath that the doctor's grim prognosis wasn't the whole truth. It was sometime after midnight when the young nurse approached me. Her name tag read Jennifer Mullins, and she couldn't have been more than 25, with red hair pulled back in a tight bun, and the kind of tired eyes that come from double shifts and difficult knowledge. She came into Sarah's room when I was standing at the window, staring out at the parking lot, and she pretended to check the monitors and adjust the four, doing all the routine things nurses do. But as she worked, she leaned close and whispered, "Miss Chun, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and you cannot tell anyone I said this. Not the doctors, not your husband's friend who's been visiting, not anyone." My heart started racing immediately. I didn't say anything, just waited. Jennifer continued, her voice barely audible, checking the monitors as though our conversation was entirely clinical. "Your sister is not as injured as they're saying. Her brain activity is low, yes, but not dead. I've been in this ICU for 2 years, and I've seen people come back from worse. But I've also seen what happens when families have money and life insurance and doctors who are willing to help them along." I asked her what she meant. She glanced at the doorway, making sure no one was listening. "I mean that 3 different medications have been charted for your sister that don't match standard protocols for her condition. I mean that the medication dosages have been increased each time your husband or his lawyer visited. I mean that I've seen the security footage from this hallway, and I watched one of the doctors inject something into her foreline that wasn't charted anywhere. And I mean that if you sign those papers, your sister will be dead before sunrise." My hands started shaking. I asked Jennifer how I could prove this, and she took a deep breath and said something I'll never forget. "There's security footage of everything that happens in this hallway. Go to the security office and tell them you want to review the footage from the past 48 hours. Tell them you're a lawyer and you're concerned about the medical care your sister is receiving. Tell them you think there's been a medication error. They have to show it to you. But listen, you need to do this quietly, and you need to do it fast. Because your sister's husband has friends here, and the longer you ask questions, the more danger we're all in. But you especially. He's already starting to position himself as the grieving widow who tried to save her. If you get in his way, he will destroy you." Then she grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong, and she said something that I can still hear in my nightmares. "Don't sign anything. Please. You have to trust me. And after you see the footage, after you understand what's happening, you're going to need to leave town. Because they're not going to let you get in the way of what they've already decided." She looked around one more time and then left the room, moving on to the next patient as though nothing had happened, as though she hadn't just handed me evidence of what appeared to be systematic poisoning of my unconscious sister. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with Sarah, and I held her hand, and I promised her that I would get to the bottom of what was happening. At 6 a.m., I went to the security office. The man on duty was named Derek, probably in his 50s, with a weathered face and the demeanor of someone who'd seen a lot of hospital politics. When I explained who I was and said I wanted to review footage from my sister's room due to medication concerns, he actually seemed relieved, like he'd been waiting for someone to ask. He led me to a small office with old monitors, the kind that looked like they belonged in a police station from the 90s. 48 hours, I said. He nodded and started the playback. The first 24 hours showed standard ICU protocol. Nurses checking vitals, doctors making rounds, monitors tracking her condition. Then, on the second day, things changed. Around 2 p.m., James entered the room with a man I recognized from hospital literature as Dr. Robert Hendricks, the attending physician. They spoke in low voices, but their body language was unmistakable. James pointed to the monitors. Dr. Hendricks nodded. Then Dr. Hendricks left the room and James sat with Sarah for 30 minutes, just holding her hand, but his face showed no grief, just calculation. That evening, Dr. Hendricks came back, and this time, he wasn't alone. He brought 2 other doctors, and they went through the standard assessment, shining lights in Sarah's eyes, checking reflexes, all the things you do to evaluate neurological status. But then, when they thought no one was looking, Dr. Hendricks did something that made my blood run cold. He injected something into Sarah's foreline directly, something that wasn't written down in any chart I would later review, something that had no medical purpose except one. The injection was followed by an immediate change in Sarah's monitoring. Her heart rate began to decline. Her oxygen saturation began to drop. Within minutes, it became clear that her condition was deteriorating rapidly. And that's when the nurses came running. That's when the emergency resuscitation protocol started. But there was something performative about it, something that felt like theater rather than genuine life-saving effort. Sarah was already crashing, and the doctors weren't trying to save her. They were trying to be seen attempting to save her, and failing appropriately, so that when James signed the papers, it would look like they'd done everything they could. I watched this play out on the grainy security footage, watching my sister's body fail not from the stroke, but from whatever was being introduced into her bloodstream. I watched doctors work to make her death look natural and unavoidable. I watched my brother-in-law manipulate every decision from outside the room, maintaining plausible deniability while orchestrating a murder. Derek, the security guard, was watching me watch this, and he said quietly, "I've been waiting for someone to ask for the footage." This hospital administration knew something was wrong. But Dr. Hendricks has connections, and your sister-in-law's husband donated $100,000 to the hospital's renovation fund last year. Sometimes evidence gets inconvenient. I asked Derek if I could get copies of the footage. He hesitated, then pulled out a flash drive. "I made these 3 days ago. I was going to take them to the police myself if no one asked for them. But this is better. This comes from family." I left that security office with evidence that would change everything. The problem was knowing what to do with it. If I went directly to the police, James would know it was coming and would prepare his defense. If I contacted a prosecutor, the hospital would find out and would use their considerable resources to discredit the evidence. The security footage showed clear misconduct, but it didn't show motive, and without motive, a good lawyer could argue that what we were seeing was simply emergency medicine in a chaotic environment. I needed more. I needed financial motive. I needed proof that James had something to gain from Sarah's death beyond the obvious inheritance. I checked into a hotel near the hospital instead of going back to stay with James. I told him I needed space to process everything, and he didn't argue. Then I contacted a private investigator, someone I'd worked with on a few cases, and I asked him to dig into James Patterson's finances, his insurance policies, his debts, everything. What he found took my breath away. James had been gambling. Not casual recreational gambling, but serious, compulsive gambling through offshore accounts and online platforms. He'd lost almost $200,000 in the past 18 months. His financial advisor business was failing because his clients had discovered his losses and were pulling their money. He was drowning in debt. And 6 months before Sarah's stroke, James had taken out a massive life insurance policy on her, $5 million, with a rider that paid out immediately upon death from natural causes. The stroke had been a gift to him. The only problem was that Sarah might recover, and a recovering Sarah would eventually discover what he'd done and what he'd become. So, he'd accelerated the timeline. He'd found Dr. Hendricks, a doctor with his own financial troubles and his own willingness to bend ethics for the right price. And he'd orchestrated my sister's death with the precision of someone who understood that all he needed was for his wife to be declared dead and for him to sign the papers. The evidence was damning. Financial motive, medical misconduct, orchestrated poisoning. But it still wasn't enough because I still needed to prove the why, the intent, the connection between James and Dr. Hendricks. And that's when I realized Jennifer Mullins, the young nurse who had tried to stop this, was gone. I went back to the hospital the next morning to show her the footage, to tell her she'd been right, to thank her for saving my sister's life by trying to save it. But the nurse manager told me that Jennifer Mullins had called in that morning and quit without notice. She'd been a good employee, they said, no warning signs, but she was young, and sometimes young people made impulsive decisions. I tried to call her. No answer. I went to the address listed in the hospital records. Landlord said she'd left town suddenly, paid her lease break, taken her car, and left. And that's when I understood the full scope of what had happened. Jennifer hadn't just tried to save Sarah. She'd been a nurse at this hospital long enough to understand how James and Dr. Hendricks actually worked, long enough to have seen this pattern before. She was probably the reason they felt like they needed to accelerate the timeline, the complication in their plan. And once she tipped me off, she'd known she needed to disappear. I didn't find her until 2 years later, and that's a story I'll tell you another time. But for now, what I can tell you is that I took everything I had to the police, and the investigation that followed was the most surreal experience of my life. Detective Sarah Morris was the lead investigator, a woman in her 50s who'd seen hospital corruption before, and who didn't hesitate to take the case seriously. With the financial records and the security footage and the testimony from Derek the security guard, they had enough to arrest James Patterson and Dr. Robert Hendricks on charges of first-degree murder. But here's the thing about the justice system that I learned through this process. Having evidence and proving your case are two very different things. James had money. He hired David Kellerman, one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the state. And David Kellerman's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and in its dishonesty. He argued that the security footage was grainy and inconclusive. He argued that the injection could have been a standard medication. He argued that the financial motive was circumstantial, that desperate people didn't necessarily commit murder, that correlation wasn't causation. He brought in expert witnesses who testified that Sarah's decline could have been natural, that stroke patients often deteriorated rapidly, that the injection visible on the footage could not be conclusively identified. The trial lasted 2 months. James sat in court every single day, wearing expensive suits, looking appropriately sad, occasionally crying at moments his lawyers coached him to cry. His defense team painted him as a devoted husband who had done everything he could to help his wife and who was now being persecuted by a vindictive sister-in-law and a hospital with an axe to grind. They questioned my motives. They suggested I was jealous of Sarah's marriage. They implied that I'd always resented her happiness. They did everything they could to turn me from the victim's advocate into the villain of the story. The jury deliberated for 8 days. On the evening of the 8th day, they came back with a verdict. Not guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. Guilty on the lesser charge of involuntary manslaughter. The judge sentenced James Patterson to 12 years in prison, with eligibility for parole in 12 years. For systematically poisoning my sister. For manipulating her death. For stealing her future and her life and her chance to recover. 12 years. I remember sitting in that courtroom when the verdict was read, and I remember feeling like the system had failed my sister in every way possible. Not just the hospital system, not just Dr. Hendricks, but the entire apparatus we supposedly built to protect people from violence and betrayal. James Patterson served 6 years before he was released on parole for good behavior. 6 years. He's currently living in Phoenix under a modified identity, and as far as I know, he's never worked again, living off the money he managed to hide from the courts and from the settlements that came later. Dr. Hendricks lost his license and served 4 years before early release. The hospital settled the lawsuit quietly, which tells you everything you need to know about how complicit they were. My mother never recovered from Sarah's death. She blamed herself for raising her to be trusting, for not teaching her to recognize manipulation, for not being there to protect her. She spent the last years of her life asking me if I'd done enough, if there was more I could have done, and there was nothing I could say that would make her feel better, because the truth was that Sarah should have lived. Sarah should still be alive. Sarah should be somewhere treating patients and living her life, and instead she's gone because she trusted the wrong person and because a hospital system prioritized protecting its reputation over investigating the death of a woman in their care. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to all of Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. Because the thing that haunted me most wasn't the verdict or the sentence or the injustice of it all, though those things haunt me deeply. What haunted me most was Jennifer Mullins. What haunted me most was knowing that someone, somewhere, had decided she was a liability and that she needed to disappear. I tried for months to find her after the trial, but it was like she'd evaporated. I hired private investigators. I checked with nursing boards in other states. I looked through social media archives. There was nothing. No Jennifer Mullins working as a nurse anywhere in America. No Jennifer Mullins with a public digital footprint. It was as though she'd ceased to exist. And that's when I realized the danger she'd been in was even greater than I'd understood. What I eventually discovered, through a connection made by the private investigator I hired, was that Jennifer had witnessed things at that hospital that went beyond my sister's case. She'd been working in the ICU for 2 years, which meant she'd been present for multiple suspicious deaths, multiple cases where patients had deteriorated rapidly after visits from certain doctors or family members, multiple scenarios that had eventually been accepted as natural decline. She'd been trying to get the hospital to investigate for months before she approached me. She'd tried to talk to the hospital administration. She'd been ignored. She'd reported concerns to medical boards. She'd been retaliated against. And when she finally took matters into her own hands and talked to me, she knew that the consequence would be her career ending. What I didn't know was that it would be more than that. 2 years after the trial, long after I thought the story was over, I received a phone call from Detective Sarah Morris. They'd found Jennifer. She'd been living in a small town in New Mexico, working as a bartender, keeping a low profile, trying to build a new life. She'd changed her name legally, had cut off contact with everyone from her old life, had done everything right to stay safe and stay invisible. But on a Tuesday evening in March, exactly 2 years after Sarah's death, she'd been killed in a hit-and-run accident outside the bar where she worked. The driver was never found. The car was never recovered. The investigation went nowhere. And everybody who understood the pattern knew exactly what had happened. Jennifer Mullins had been murdered because she'd tried to save my sister's life. She'd been murdered because she'd had the courage to blow the whistle on a corrupt hospital and a corrupt doctor and a murderous family member. She'd been murdered because sometimes in America, the cost of doing the right thing is your life. I gave up practicing law after that. I couldn't make the system work the way it was supposed to work. I couldn't see justice served in the way I believed justice should be served. I couldn't accept a world where my sister was dead, where her killer served only 6 years, where the person who tried to save her was killed for trying. So, I started this channel. I started telling stories. Because I believe that sometimes the only justice available is truth. The only power we have is the power to make sure people remember, to make sure these stories don't get buried, to make sure that the world knows what happened even when the courts fail us. Sarah's death could have been prevented. Jennifer's death could have been prevented. These are the stories of people who trusted the wrong people, and I'm going to keep telling them until something changes. Because sometimes the most dangerous place isn't the street. It's the room where you're told everything is fine. It's the hospital where you're supposed to be safe. It's the marriage you built on the foundation of trust. It's the system that's supposed to protect you, but instead protects itself. And if my mother thinks I won't reach 1,000 subscribers with stories like this, then she doesn't understand the hunger people have for truth, for justice, for meaning in the chaos of loss. These stories matter. They matter because they're real. They matter because they happen to people we could have known, people just like us, people who made the mistake of trusting the wrong person. So please, if you're still listening, subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories. Share these stories. Comment about what you would have done. Tell me if you would have signed those papers. Tell me if you would have trusted the system. Tell me if you would have fought the way I fought. Because that's how we build something better. That's how we make sure that the next person in my position has more power, more resources, more belief from the system that's supposed to protect them. My sister Sarah Chin Patterson was 39 years old when she died. She wanted to help people. She wanted to make a difference. She was kind and strong and deeply, profoundly trusting. And the fact that those qualities were used against her, that her trust became her death sentence, is a failure of all of us. So, let's do better. Let's listen to the whispers of the people trying to save us. Let's question the authorities who move too fast. Let's demand investigations when something feels wrong. Let's fight for each other the way I wish I'd been able to fight for Jennifer. Because the truth is the only thing that lasts after the verdict is read and the sentence is reduced and the murderer walks free. The truth is what we have left when justice fails. And if I'm going to spend the rest of my life telling these stories, then I'm going to make damn sure they matter.